Okay, we can start from now, but before that, yeah. I'm Sani Kosari, or you guys can call me Sani from President University. Will be the chair and only judge because I don't have any panels or trainee adjudicating with me. So yeah, without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Halo, audible nggak ya?
Audible.
Oke, thank you. Oh ya, Hi guys. Oke. POI through chat box. Yeah, pronounce data.
Okay.
Starting. Through chat box. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I have two important setup before going to my argumentation. Firstly, how we defend field of medicine and healthcare. I think it is also about like psychological health, policy, and access, and also advocacy that people are trying to talk about in the very first place, right? Because at the end of the day, medicine and also healthcare cannot be separated into social and etc. Because it is coexist together. But second of all, I think what the other contrafactual that maybe possibly happen when we are not going to be like genderly neutral research and etc. I think it is about the research that more likely to be gender specific, not only like gender specific by women and also men, but also about trans people and also non-binary people. That if that possible, it will grow even more further into a more specific group in the very first place. I have two argumentation in my speech. Firstly, why this most likely to be like male dominated and why this is something that will have a really bad impact in the very first place. But second of all, how we can protect even more people under outside of the house. Welcome to my first argumentation. Why this most likely to be like male dominated and why this is something that bad. First of all, I think like the reason why most likely the subject of the research is basically dominated by male are consists of three things. Firstly, it is because like the researchers right now in current status quo most likely dominated also by men. And I think that it is something that will correlately that they're also seeking from some one that around them in the very first place to do a lot of research and also people that maybe like have more interaction to them. But second of all, I think it is also about we cannot control the equivalent and of the research itself about the quality of the gender and etc. Because it is something that probably will like random sampling and etc. So we cannot see more initiative and also incentive to reach more to people that most likely to be like gender minority and etc. Because you just accept your data as it is. But thirdly, I think like men more likely to be like comfortable to say it and also like to giving other people known about their illnesses. Because why? Because at the end of the day, we're living in the current status quo where there is like patriarchy that people understanding that no matter what happened to you as a man, you will be accepted anyway. But if you have any like certain types of illnesses, like maybe the problem like in your reproduction, etc., you will be stigmatized in the very first place because you will be portrayed like not a complete woman and etc. I think why think that medicine need to be specific in the very first place? I have two reasons why it need to be specific. Firstly, I think it is highlighting the unique causes and also the unique needs of individual by the factor of gender itself. For example, more people like women get the depression because of gender abuse by domestic violence and etc. Or more like trans people get depression because of the social construct and etc. Meanwhile, also the production illness is more likely to be accepted by women because the sanitation problem and sanitation issue. This is why at the end of the day, we need to do gender specific researches to at the end of the day improve the treatment to be more specific of the root causes of different genders in the very first place. But second of all, I think it is about the perceived risk and also violence. I think it is pretty important to understand that the researcher will be like talking about statistic or prevalence that difference between men and also women and also risk factor and etc. It's all something that differentiate all genders in the very first place. It is show that others might be more likely to be vulnerable as compared to another gender. So I think it is like giving like more priority to certain types of illnesses by gender and etc. Why then it is important? It's important to make a protection policy in healthcare, because how it's going, I think like when you want to make a protection medicine policy, for example, we need to translating all of the resources by the policy maker in the very first place. But we cannot like have a fiat by saying that all of the policymaker understanding to at the end of the limitation or the problem that really access in the when it's not differentiated. What does it mean? It is harder to create woman and also it is harder to create woman and WGM protection, for example, because it less specific researchers need to be more like than one research to be like creating more policy to support your argument and etc. It is also about rising advocacy and also urgency. The more you have urgency by showing by this more like gender research at the end of the day, the easier you get advocacy about specific needs of gender at the end of the day, right? Why this is better? Because healthcare, it's not only biological, it is also sociological. That broader our perspective, it is pretty important, because somehow the problem that happened to us, it's not like generally just happened to us, but it is because there is a social norms that imposed to one another that makes us to be prone and on risk of certain types of prevalence of the illnesses. Second argumentation, how we can protect even more people under our side of the house. What is the currently research will be look like? It is look like gender research will be like fade away because of the efficiency reason at the end of the day. We think we need more like trans and also like others gender researchers, because we need a proper understanding about them. The use of hormone that might be affecting other drugs that this a transgender have need to be researched even more. Or second of all, the lead to more researches about better treatment without cutting their special needs of the individual. Like I said before, the special needs of the transgender probably like using hormones and etc. Or the special needs of women to be like still have on period and etc. I think it is pretty important not only to protect them in medical healthcare, but also to protect them in their social life, to not also be like criticized by the society and also stigmatized and etc. I think it is also about resource and efficiency, right? Currently, like it is efficient and giving more excuse to do like something like random sampling and etc. The fact that it is will like erase the fact that it is something that urgency, denying the fact that there is we need like more priority than another in the very first place. Because under our side of the house, when we do gender research specific, means it creates more incentive for researchers that want to research to gender specific to even more broadening their specific make more specific gender research in the very first place to engage to more and more minority. This is how our world will be look like, and we proudly to propose.
Okay, thank you for your very fine speech. To open the debate on the opposition side and to replying the government side, I calling upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
POI through chat. I'll take one if I have time. Hopefully I have. I will set up my timer first. Can I drink? Can I have water, please? Itu tuh. Hai, arigato. Here you go. Bentar ya. Udah. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. While that comparative is inevitable in this debate, I'd like to posit that we are not against gender-based study, because we believe that gender-based study have its own function in general, especially for specific concern related to gender. For instance, specific diseases that specifically affect certain type of gender. For instance, cervix cancer that are specifically affecting someone with cervix, for instance, right? That will not be gone, and that would still exist on our side. But the debate need to specifically argue on the discussion and the function of non-gendered study, whether or not not that it has more benefit or whether or not that it has more harm. For us, for long as you can be able to interpret in the speech of the government side of the house, what they want is simple. They want to ensure that there is more progression in regard to what research that specifically catered to the needs of the gender minority. Now, the issue with this is that while that the urgency correct, however, the solution are lack in feasibility, because if you evaluate this particular argumentation, they never really explain to widen the absence of this particular non-gendered study, which by the way you cannot eliminate because this is not a mechanical debate but also evaluative debate. They never actually explain to why there would be more motivation for, let's say, researchers that they claim to be conservative and also discriminative in general to care more about issues that are specific for, let's say, certain type of gender minority. Because if that is the assumption, it is going to also likely in your side where the focus of a more general concern, like depression is very general by the way, are going to be much more centralized in the way that it affects men, because they are by societal standard, like what you say, are higher in hierarchy as opposed to, let's say, gender minority according to these conservative researchers. That is to say, this is not something that they have catered. But even if I want to take on the best case where you could be able to have an equal access of both of this research, it's still true to some certain extent that there would be more problem in a way that the implication of the research would be when you are treating a general concern and issue for and diseases in a more specific matter like gender study. I'm going to just talk about the contextualization. All responses would just directly be implied with this. So what is the context of medical and healthcare industry in current status quo? One, it is very male-dominated sectors where misunderstanding of research for WGM exists and are constantly undermined by virtue of their gender status or psychological assumption. This implies that in general, there are two things. One, focuses are more often than not would not be equal in a set of affirmative because the research done to create sample of medicine for male are going to be more infested compared to women. And this is a realistic things and has happened in a very specific gender study. Even if the investment is the same, the way that the solution introduced are going to be very different. In a way that solution that is introduced for certain gender minority are treated more simplistically in opposing to what, let's say, male, for example, e.g., there are very comprehensive criteria on ADHD research for male, but barely for female, and there are a lot of misunderstanding on this because they are treated on a different aspect of gender. The problem with this is that the framework of gender, the existing implication that are going to be generated based on the hierarchy that has been mentioned before relied heavily on whether or not that the intention of the researchers can always be, let's say, can always be inclusive and can always be willing to invest in an equal manner, which is not the case, which is go to what the second problem with their case then. Interpretation that are made are very gendered influence. The way that researchers interpret their research are very correlated to the assumption on the ground. So this manifests into three things. One, willingness to expand research for a very general issue in diseases are minimum. Let's say the AIDS epidemic are a very general concern that do not just happen to, let's say, specific type of gender, for instances. And it's unfortunate we do know that to some certain extent, some gender probably have a more numbered of, let's say, AIDS patient back in the days, but this is a more general concern that can affect everyone. The willingness to expand it are very limited because there is an assumption of discrimination that this is more likely happen to this gender. Second, there is less option to open your sample, right? E.g., the different treatment on, let's say, PCOS between male and female subject and the way that it is concluded are very different, and there is very little to no intention for you to be able to treat it in equal way. Male subject resulted into a more serious discussion on how it impact them. Female subject treated and are treated and more related to the way to things that are irrelevant. For instance, their level of attractiveness, or some research and treatment of some STD that are also very discriminative when it comes to a gender-based research are made on an assumption that, let's say, the focus of populace in female or like WGM, let's say, populace are focused on a specific type of, let's say, work, for instance, like prostitution, instead of more general populace that they do in the male study, right? So even if it is not discriminative by number, it is still implying to a lot of assumptions that are integrated when it is heavily on non-gendered. I need to emphasize that a lot of these concerns are general, and it is important for you to make it as general as possible, because the reason being as non-gendered study matter because one, it serves a specific purpose that directly cater to the problem that government want, which is that it is more detached on societal and gender construction and only focuses on a more general biological disposition like hormones and chromosome. Second, it also means that the specific concern of WGM are more likely to be addressed at generic sample trait, which make it harder for researchers to ignore in our side of the house, but easily ignore because now they can specify their, let's say, research on their side of the house, right? So you have more inclusion on our side of the house on the basis of you having to make sure that your your sample populace need to be as, let's say, as widespread as possible. There's this thing when it comes to non-gender research where you need to make sure that your population need to be as general as possible as well to ensure that you can get that to a more general sense to that. But the reason being why then this is true, because the classification is most likely going to be based on traits, symptoms. In specific by nature, if they say that it's sociological, we don't think it's true because biology are the most inclusive aspect. It is non-gendered, which means that everybody can enter this. It should be considered on sexes instead of gender, like factor of hormones, distribution of chromosomes, which are stereotypically assumed only exist in certain gender, will not be a problem in our side. The conclusion of non-gender research in our side and why it's beneficial then is that the lack and absence of this will further harm the effort of inclusion, which is their end goal. But the absence of a gender on the criterion in research allow a less discriminative population sample in our side benefit and focus more on the subject as a research, meaning that you get a much more conclusive, let's say, result of, let's say, treatment that you need as well for women that are generally discriminated. But the specific type of harm that they want to address has been addressed in status quo, which by non-gender study, right, which compel researchers to include everyone that is relevant based rate and criterion of their symptoms, and we think that that is better as opposed to their solution. More than proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for your very fine speech. To continuing the debate in the government side, I call upon the DPM here.
Sorry, hi. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you both are.
Okay. Oh, wait, drink first. By the way, as a person coming from STEM background that is heavily man-dominated fields, thank you so much, IWGM judges, for making these motions. I'm so happy that we are able to debate this motion.
Bye.
Sorry guys, ada orang. If there is any background noise, please let me know because there's some quiet event behind us. Timer. POI, don't go through chat, yeah. Just raise your hand or unmute. I will not be seeing the chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First of all, I would like to clarify what a non-gendered research looks like. Because if opposition were to say that they are going to use the research that is sex-based, for example, it has yet to explain like the entirety of non-gendered non-gendered research, because we feel like non-gendered research supposed to be how researchers do not care about the balance of genders, for example, within the samples of the research. So they do not control like how many men participants, how many women participants that needs to be in their research. We think that how non-gendered research has always looks like, which sadly is being used to a lot of medical research, which is why a lot of medical implications are actually the implications that is trait specific towards like male born individual, for example. But I'm also going to elaborate further. Firstly, on like social implications, then secondly, on the incentive of like trajectory of medical treatment to the extent of like, the social complexity of like medical treatment as well. So first of all, I just want to talk about how participations in clinical trial is actually related to social struggles that actually distinct between gender. Number one, the process of clinical trial are usually a very man-centric in the first place. First, who are likely to be included or participate in medical research? Assume that in opposition, it happens without the researcher having to control the amount of like male or female in the research, right? A, it is likely to be people who report the case. That means people who go to clinic, people who receive treatment or medications. But how? This can be very centric towards men. First, the stigma that male is a breadwinner of the family, hence making them rather more concerned in sickness, for example. That's why they are likely to report, because if they are sick or they do not get treatment, they cannot serve food on the table, for example. But secondly, what does it also mean? On the other hand, women, for example, that is treated as a homemaker in many traditional background in country like South Africa, for example, are not seen as that important, because if they are sick, they are then less likely in comparison to their husband, for example, to report and to receive treatment. The thing is, this is important because one, in research trials or clinical trials, for example, usually researchers take a look upon reported cases of diseases. That's why who likely to participate is men to begin with, right? Whether the researcher have the incentive or not, it is uncontrollable that men in status quo participated in more research. But secondly, I don't think that even though research world is initially built by men-dominated fields, currently we already see like there are gender-based studies, for example, gender research centers and whatnot, which we argue, yes, even if not as much as the mainstream research center, but still can be a powerful tool. But also, secondly, the participation is important, and that's why you need to make it specific, because it affects the implications or explanations within the research. Because now we see, for example, the risk of cardiac arrest in men is higher than to women, but that's not because women are included within the research and is indeed more sustained like cardiac arrest, but because men are more participative in comparison to women, for example. Hence, leads to the implications of how the treatments should be, not only when it comes to drugs, but also when it comes to like psychological assistance, for example, to things that is heavily sensitive, that contributive to the risk factor of the disease. But secondly, those people who does not report because of whatever situations that they are in, people who are vulnerable on their side, assuming that research is mostly evil, then are still going to be underreported, right? Because they are not incentivized to report, because they are not told that cardiac arrest is just as highly dangerous in women and also in men, for example. This is how the incentive under their side for like people, WGM, for example, mostly are not going to exist. But secondly, why gender blind research is also the reason that researchers going to further undermine social struggle. Because one, even though under your side of the house, yes, you sign up. Wait, later. You can sign up. It's 5 minutes. Wait, I still have things to talk. You can sign up without assigning your gender or your sex, but that becomes a reason for you, for example, as a non-binary or like as a transgender specifically, who have specific medical like difference to other, to be more repressed, right? Because you are not forced to eventually explain your current conditions that might be helpful for other transgenders as well, for example. Which leads my second point, that if shifting the trajectory of the medical treatment, first of all, how this is good for incentive towards gender-specific research. Number one, we can see that maybe gender-specific research is not going to be as abundant. Like people who research on like specific effect on hormones treatment to transgender are not going to be as abundant. But we think that is why this can start from, for example, the research ethics that start to be more inclusive towards like WGM to protect these participants as well. This is not something impossible. The fact that there are a lot of like gender research institute that care about these things. But secondly, this is also means the incentive to change the educations of the current disease or medical condition prevalence and risk factor, which usually in like research paper, they only imply, less research on women. Maybe because they do not want to explain how the disease affects women, but because research is statistic based, that's why they cannot refer to how the effect on women could be. They cannot just guess like so because it's a research paper. But lastly, incentives towards like therapy and medication of the disease, not only when it comes to drugs, but also the social pressures that contribute to the diseases in itself. Like, for example, transgender women or men might face hormonal imbalance from hormone therapy, but also when you neglect their identity, you're neglecting the societal rejections of transgenders, for example, that contribute to psychological burden that become risk factor for these particular diseases, which will be unique compared to like cis individual, for example. That's why vote for WGM, vote for propositions.
Okay, thank you for your very fun speech. To continue the debate on the opposition side, I calling upon the DLO here.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. Any I just unmute. I wouldn't be looking at the chat. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, governments state that medicine needs to be specific on gender because there is different life experiences of different gender. I have several responses for this. First, you need to differentiate between medicine or healthcare study and social study. Those are two very different things, and it can be dangerous if medical researchers in this world believe just because you get a certification in biology, it allows you to judge social lives of women. Not to mention because government agree that there is a gender bias, meaning that you perpetuate that, you give more opportunity for that bias to be manifested because you allow that for that kind of analysis to happen, and you even encourage that kind of analysis to be taken into account. Second response is that it's even worse because you don't only allow that, but you allow it to manifest in a form of study. It took a folks intelligent form, making it harder to deny because it is packaged in a logical way when it is based on unfounded beliefs and stereotypes. Third is that you tend to leave out other possible aspect because you're too focused on gender. So even if, let's take a charitable scenario, gender-based research is done correctly, there is no element of sexism, it still limits the horizon of the research when the research should be open to multiple possible answer to the hypothesis. Because the result can be explained by so many things. It can be due to your exercise level, it can be due to your food intake. But the first thing researcher will assume is that it must has something to do with gender, and that's what's dangerous because it limits your horizon and it limits the open-mindedness that research is supposed to have. For example, a good example to illustrate the 3 points of my responses is that in AIDS, for example, on government, although this is an autoimmune disease and everyone have immunity and everyone have autoimmune, these researchers will not make it a non-gendered approach, although AIDS can be have by both men and women. They will make it become a gendered approach, and that's why it has happened in the past that researchers end up drawing conclusion that AIDS happened because homosexual man is more sexually active, or the slur is a sex variant, and that's why they do anal sex, and that's why they are the cause of the disease. So you allow that bias to happen. On our side, since AIDS is not a gender specific disease, then it wouldn't be done through gender research. We feel like there is no reason to do that, and that's why the first response isn't about, oh, it must be because of homosexual sex, but it can be, oh, you know what, it's a partly through blood, oh, you know what, it's a partly through yes, sexual liquid, one of those. But it opens up more horizon, and it opens up more reason why the result can be that way, so it becomes more comprehensive in nature. That is the benefit on our side. So I think from these responses, what I want to conclude is that I think government kind of missed the burden of the motion, because look at the motion, we never have a burden to say that we don't like gendered research, or we would rather live in a world where gendered research is absent, because we love gendered research when it is appropriate, aka when it is done when the actual disease is gender related, i.e., like my first speaker said, it's cervical cancer or menstrual pain. Obviously, like you couldn't possibly do non-gender. So the question, the burden that government never answer is that why non-gendered study is bad. That's first burden they never actually answer. And second is that they need to answer the burden why, when it is a general issue, you would still prefer to always see everything from the lens of the gendered approach, i.e., assuming it always have something to do with gender. I hope those two burdens are clear on government, and I hope the next speaker clarify that. So moving on to my extension. Oh, you know what? But before that, any POI. 1, 2, 3. Cool. So moving on to extension. I'm going to tell you how research is ideally conducted, the steps by steps of it, and why having non-gender research is actually a good alternative because it brings more benefits than harms. So in choosing test subjects, and this is going to be a direct response towards DPM because DPM said on our side, non-gendered research will have very limited amount of female or other minority gender representation because they feel like male is more important since they are the breadwinner, so we should care about how to make men be free, be cured of the disease because they are the breadwinner. So in choosing test subjects, the first thing is that I want to say is that any research out there always have guidelines that needed to be followed through. You can talk about any institution out there, but essentially there is due diligence. And the most basic thing is random sampling, which is that you draw from a population randomly, and then that's how you choose your test subject. Meaning that by virtue of probability, it's likely that we will have probably 50 male and 50 female. If not exactly like that, at the very least, it's not going to be like 90% male or and only 10% female. It's very unlikely on the balance of probability. So that random sampling is a common concept that is also applicable to things like how do you make sure there is diverse socioeconomic background? How do you make sure there is diverse geographical location, diverse age, diverse occupation, because you want as best representation as possible. So if we already implement random sampling on those aspects, we will we do the same as well for gender in making sure that there is enough representation. So that's a response to DPM's challenge, and that's why I think we can prove that there will be enough representation of gender. But also, please do realize if DPM said that there is a bias, then they don't really solve the problem on their sides. Because if you say that you want to do gender research, but you say there is a tendency for male to be perceived as more important because they are breadwinner, that means gendered research on your side will be for male only because they're the one that is important. So I think that just shows there's more benefit on our side, and how on their side, when they try to attack us, it doesn't necessarily solve on their problem either. The other part of building a research which is important is also in building hypothesis in the preparation part. I think gendered research, when it is done inappropriately through all kinds of research, even when it is a general tactic, it tends to be more assumptive in nature. Because let's say even if it's done through a lens that is more progressive, i.e., oh, I want to be more woman in this research because this specific treatment is probably effective against this specific hormone that exists in women. That would mean the hypothesis isn't checked after the result of the experiment. The hypothesis is already implemented directly when you choose your subject pool. So that would mean the bias started early on, while idea of the experiment is supposed to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. So that's why I might as well take all people, see how many of the population responded to the treatment. Let's say only 50% responded well to the treatment. That would be a better conclusion rather than you thinking, oh, I should just collect all women and then decide however it is. So the point is, regardless of all sexism happens, agree, yes, but in the charitable scenario, we prove to you that we get better research study in general. Proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for your very fine speech. To close the debate on the government theme, I calling upon the government with here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you both are.
All right, wait a second. All right. Uh, okay. Pronouns she, her. Sorry if there's like background noise. I hope it's not too distracting. I'll try to be audible throughout my whole speech. And Yeah, PI, just raise your hand or to the chat box. I'll try to take one. All right. Starting my speech in trigger warning. Yeah, maybe like something sensitive. I hope it doesn't come off the wrong way. It's purely for the debate. 3, 2, 1. When talking about the idea of general, or maybe just say something like, as in like trying to portray something as generic as possible, because I think the whole case of like opposition is very contingent on the fact that there is something that is so generic, especially in healthcare, when we know that it's actually very complex and stuff like that, to the point that it can be discredited to just like a bunch of people filling surveys without having to portray about like their gender, which, as we know, also gender actually like affects our social life and affects like every single thing that we're looking at, all right? Because like, let's contest this on the idea of depression. And it's mentioned that, okay, like depression is general, or maybe like cough medicine is general. Like, how is the survey going to taste? Like, let's not maybe even talk about like the survey on how it affects the people, but maybe on how it gets delivered to the people, in talking about like the healthcare system and like the medical system itself, such as the pricing and stuff like that. To some extent, I would contest to you that maybe some women or maybe some gender minorities are not going to be able to afford this generic cough medicine because simply they have problems about their gender, like for example, gender discrimination in their workplace, or they don't get paid enough to be able to pay upon this kind of like price that is put upon, right? But because you have non-gender research, you just think like, oh, these are just like some random people who cannot afford this without even taking a consideration on how this gender affects. So if they're trying to talk to you by mentioning that, you know, gender is actually like doesn't matter that much and it just creates stigma, I try to contest to you that it matters that much, not even to the point of like medical and like how the medicine gets perceived, but also to the point of how it gets delivered in healthcare system, how it gets consumed by these people. Yes, the LO contest by saying, well, that's social research, that's not medical research. But like, to think of it all, medical research also needs social research, right? Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make humans feel better. You are trying to erase their sickness. And this is not only like some simple talks about like biology, because I contest to you also like contingents about like mental sickness and also like mental illness. I think to some extent it must be accepted that social issues, especially social research, plays a huge role in medical research, even if not the research, but also how you try to like publicize that, oh, we need some people to take drug trials, we need some people to like come to our clinic and take tests. That is also a part of social communication and needs some certain methods to be able to understand towards it. But also coming again to the idea of generalness and to the idea of generic. To you, who made the definition of this genericness? Because I don't think it's because some researchers start to do like gender-based research on like, let's say, depression, and suddenly they found, oh, it actually affects all gender normally, so let's just do non-gender-based research. I contest to you that what happens when people mention that, oh, there is a non-based gender or there is something generic to the population is because from the very first start of this research being existed is that people immediately put non-gender-based ideologies and non-gender-based perspectives toward the research that is going on, right? So how can you suddenly to be generic when you don't even have to point out the gender specific that exist under these conditions or exist under this research? So I contest to you that the idea of genericness and also the idea of general is kind of vague already in the idea of research, because there is no way to prove that it is actually that generic. There is no way to actually prove that it is actually that general, because coming back again today, even if you don't buy that idea, that it's never going to truly be general, because from the very first time, there has been no effort to prove that it affects gender on certain terms. I also contest to you that most likely all this idea of genericness, like for, let's say you have a generic symptom or you have a generic reaction towards a drug trial and stuff like that, it's also based by the male dominated sample population that exists because of our current social and like gender-based discrimination that happens as researchers and also people that are willing to be part of the research, right? So that's why I feel like just because they opposition mentions that it's gonna be good because there are generic population that we need to apply to, it cannot really exist that way, because I have contested and proven that generic population doesn't really exist. There is an effort to prove that that population is not generic itself. But also too, on the idea later again, because I think we have also concern to you that our biggest concern is that non-gendered research pushes away the spotlight for gendered research. We have proven to you, right? Gendered research is actually very significant because we think that each medicine, each treatment, each healthcare system can have a gender perspective towards it that will affect how the medicine not only get consumed but also delivered and also communicated towards that person. Because I come to you, if the idea is that, like, let's talk numbers, let's talk statistics. You put out a research for a drug trial to like some group of people, and let's say like 50%, 50 male answered this research, 15 female answered this research, and then 2 trans female answered this research. One who have gone through like a surgery and like one who haven't gone to surgery. These 2 specific trans female data is only seen as an anomaly because they stick in a very small number of data. And what do researchers do to this? Obviously, because like they're trying to do a non-gendered research, they're gonna focus on the idea that, oh yeah, later on, like the main basis of the idea is that we don't have to make it very specified to gender. So if an anomaly exists, then we can test it later. We don't have to figure out like what can this anomaly exist, because specifically later on in scientific and biologic research, the main idea is not to apply to a generic population or to apply to the most majority, but it is to prove why, if there is an anomaly that exists in your research, how can that anomaly exist, and what is the answer towards that anomaly, right? And which to push away the light of gender-specific research, which why the non-gender-based research is doing, then you can have that. But also specific more on the idea of why inherently it's gonna be bad, and the comparative on what we have proven and like why it's actually good, like by mentioned by opposition. I think proven to you why is it bad, because it tries to define something as generic when overall we have proven to you that genericness cannot really exist in a society which has been male dominated in all sectors of life. But also, 2, we have proven to you that it overshadows effort for gender research and equality, because now it's seen that non-gender research is something easy. It is something that is effortless because you can just pick a random sample and you don't have to care for like your accountability, because like, yeah, no one is checking and balance because simply there is no gender specific data to prove that you are wrong or to prove that you are not being equal enough in your research. So the accountability also like pushes away people and incentive to do more gender research idea. But also last, I think over to you later on, that inherently also harmful because it proves to people that your gender does not really matter in your biological and your health standards, when I have already proven to you how it actually affects not only why the research is made, but also the data that it shows and like the future data for references. And the only good thing coming from them is because it can apply to a generic value. Well, I think if you like compare the 3 harms that is very inherent to one generic value benefit, it is clear that we have won the debate. Thank you, and propose.
Okay, thank you for the very fine speech. To close the debate on the opposition team, I calling upon the opposition will appear here.
Assuming my voice is not as clear as my teammates' device here.
Yeah.
Okay, I will move to my teammates.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, udah mute. Okay, I can hear my own voice. If you hear typing, it's my teammate, sorry. Poi through chat. And timer. I will start my speech. In 3, 2, 1. Just to frame one thing out of the debate. People's willingness to expose their biological conditions or likelihood to go to doctors is not related to research. It's affected by 3 other things. 1, their trust towards science, especially modern medicine. 2, their trust towards establishment like government or hospitals. And 3, the general social distrust towards public service that unfortunately bleeds into medical public service. So the cause is not research in itself. Correlation is not causation. So this issue is inexclusive at best and irrelevant to the motion at worst. Now, let me clear up the difference between two things. A, the condition that strictly only attacks certain reproductive organ or people with certain chromosomes like intersex XXY, for example, or only women and men will obviously only have those identities in the data pool. Like prostate cancer will only have men, trans women, and intersex in it. Also, this debate only argue on the harm and good, so it will not affect the existence of this gender-based research. Like, it can still exist. So that's the first thing that we don't think will be affected by opposition. The second thing that we are going to bite the bullet off is condition that, yes, can happen to anyone and in any body parts, but more often target specific reproductive organ, like prostate or ovarian cancer. We're going to bite the bullet that even research on those parts is going to be generalized, like cancer in general, like the kind of cancer that can attack prostate maybe is like a cyst, so like it will be under cyst or myoma research, for example. But we will explain further why inclusion in medical research should be a derivative product, a byproduct of a non-gendered research, but it should not have been the start of a medical research. So that's the frame. I'm going to bring two things. First, why gender-based research is not ideal, and later on, why non-gender-based research is ideal. So let's dive into why gender-based research is not ideal. I'm going to play on the context of affirmative setup, where the world is male dominated, whether it's in the field of medic or in the society. So I think that the main issue that my team has provided to you is that gender-based research, if utilized in such a world, opens the opportunity of connecting the conclusion of a research or even the hypothesis of a research to a gender social status and sociological assumption about a certain gender. This is not a problem about the kind of research. It is a problem on a male researcher, which affirmative set is dominating, and my LO and DLO characterized as their hypothesis will be biased, their conclusion will be biased. What will this translate into? Historically, this has translated into two things. One, lack of diagnosis to gender minority. ADHD is only recently diagnosed in female children and adults because the basis of symptoms was traits that was socially defiant from feminine gender roles. This is not even an issue of whether the research is gendered or not gendered. It's the basis of symptoms that was used. So it results to lack of diagnosis, right? But secondly, improper diagnosis and solution. Neurological and psychological issues in the past on women that causes hallucination or manic episode, for example, were classified as hysteria. Unlike ADHD, this has a diagnosis basis, but it is improper because men was the one that decided on it. And therefore, the solution to those hysteria further incriminates and vilify women, like locking them in asylum, resulting to lobotomy, for example. This is the same with non-heterosexuality, what's deemed as an illness with the solution of electrocution to alter the brain. So that's the second thing, improper diagnosis and solution. But thirdly, unethical research purpose. In the modern era, the first big PCOS research, and PCOS is Kista Rahim, basically, done by a group of men, tried to deduce the level of attractiveness of women with PCOS and without. So from those three things, lack of diagnosis, improper diagnosis and solution, and also unethical research purpose, show that the concept of a gendered research is likely to be executed within a non-ethical intent or come to a non-ethical conclusion by the majority, especially back then, but unfortunately still a fact until now. Since this is an evaluative debate about has brought more harm, that's my proof of why it has brought more harm. Now, secondly, let's move to non-gender-based research. Non-gender-based research, I will divide into two. First, the question of whether random sampling require quota for it to be representative. First layer, I would like to hear government team's justification on why the representativeness have to be in the data pool, especially because most of their issues is more on the researcher pool and not the data pool. It's more on how people interpret the result. The second layer, the standard of representativeness for treatment and illnesses that can be suffered by all genders should not first and foremost be based on gender, but on average. This will respond to DPM's idea. Yes, our researcher won't care about equalizing gender representation in the data pool, but the varieties that they are going to care about is comorbidity, is non-gendered biological description, exactly
exactly because researchers are male-dominated in their own words, it's really important to detach clinical trials and research completely from the idea of gender. It needs to be completely medicalized without any consideration for social factors. Where those social factors can come in is in the derivative studies that tries to interpret these neutral studies, because that encapsulates the social discussion within the social sphere. Now, secondly, the way the data is going to be processed. So this is no longer about random sampling of data pool. What kind of inclusivity and standard is necessary in a non-gendered research? One, you will consider the preconditions, such as hereditary illnesses, to assess the effect on potential comorbidity with other pre-existing illnesses, because those illnesses usually alters the internal going-ons of a body, especially if they're also medicated. Like there's so many variables that can cause the symptoms to manifest differently. The second thing that they will consider is descriptive condition, such as certain hormonal threshold, like high progesterone or high testosterone, muscle or bone mass, weight class, like fat percentage, for example. This is important because there are intersex people, there are women and men who has different threshold than what's outwardly detectable through their physiology. So there are anomalies even in the gender. And there are also people across ages that have anomaly as well. That's why it should not be age-based. It should not be gender-based. It should be based on descriptive condition that is not related to social gender. The LO already mechanized to you that you can get this through variety of location, variety of profession, which is most likely are not going to be gendered anyway, so it will still be representative. And this clash with PM's idea. We agree that it's important to identify risk factor, but we shall not start from gender profiling. We think follow-up research on specific demography will organically happen. After the initial research, there will be re-evaluation and follow-up research which specifically identify risk factor and side effects based on specific symptom. People who show similar symptom will be considered as one specific data pool. So if certain gender is more likely to show certain symptom, they naturally will dominate the data pool by percentage, right? So that's how you're going to get inclusivity, but we don't think that inclusivity in terms of data pool should be something that has been enforced through the metric of gender, and that's why we're proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for your very fine speech. To conclude and summarize all the opposition side, I calling upon a reply of the opposition here.
Hi, reply opposition will be Jess.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that the assessment and the debate on who should win should be these two. Number one, which team that able to provide a more comprehensive analysis in regard to whether or not that the research can, let's say, benefit or harm the context of the people that are being discussed within the debate. But the second thing is that whether or not that there's willfulness to be able to engage in a best case and in a more good faith interpretation of the institution that we are discussing. Because while the opposition do not want to engage in a good faith of how they interpret the institution and medical industry in general, they do want to co-op and claim the benefit of having an improvement of more progressive research to gender minority, which is very unlikely and not explained, because what they say is that there would be some level of progressivity in second speaker, but there is never any conclusion to whether or not that the absence of this particular non-gendered research would automatically means that there are more care and there would be more attention given to what the gender minority specifically, if that's what they want, right? They have fail and lose on that particular case. I'm going to clarify a few things and then going to just conclude to widen option. One, two things I want to clarify. They want to claim that all issues are supposedly significantly different in a gendered, in a different gender. In our setup, we have explained that gender is a social construct which agreed by their own self that has a very limited influence to disease, except on probability for you to cut it, which also agreed on by them. E.g., it is likely for women in a red light district to contract STD because of the nature of their profession. True, but understand that the consent of this, let's say that the absence of wages, the intention of wanting to report are not resolved because it is sociological and it is not correlated with the research study to begin with, because it depends on other variable, awareness, improvement of government system, which is irrelevant or just correlated but not a causation responded by grace, not a new thing. Second, their best output that has been assumed as well is a more gendered product, right? Without explaining how significantly different it is that it requires specification, because in our side we have explained that specification can be manifested in different way that is through, let's say, different differences in sex, differences in, let's say, the nature of you as in your biology, for instance, which also going to ensure that the research can be as comprehensive, just not genderized, because gendered do not really cater into the complexity that are correlated toward the medical improvement or quality of the overall product. So there is never any type of answer that is provided by them to whether it is automatically made. It is going to specify it in a way that it is gendered. More often than not, you're going to be used by a pharmaceutical company so they can sell a more pricier product with very minimum differences. But why an op should win? I think that there's one issue, right? In regard to the comprehensiveness of research, we have explained two things. One, principle and method of inclusion by random sampling, which ensured by standardized of the research institution based on probability, or also need to ensure variation of comorbidity in improving the result quality. These are ignored and simplified by affirmative to us to not care about the complexity of research and medical condition. Two, we also have explained key point of representation that need to be appropriate on issue. Even if there is some aspect of gender that is influencing the result, which what they say, we have engaged to this. So talk about the inclusion that are going to be better, even as early as setup, and also engagement of the second speaker. Better on a non-gendered, because then you can you can ensure that there would be more willingness. There is less limitation to include more WGM in order for them to be catered in a general specific study that do not cater them otherwise, and they would be ignored in their side of the house. So active inclusion and stereotype based on symptoms and solution are on their side, but on our side you get more incentive to want to make sure that this is as randomized as possible. Their explanation are just generally less comprehensive in defending the research study because it is built on dissonance between the context and call to action. If the contexts are very male-centric and discriminative, what would it be likely for gender-based research for WGM to rise up? Has been engaged as well in our side of the house to why then it is less likely in a specific characterization, because this is not an automatic benefit you can just get, or like not an automatic harm you can ignore. So it is more logical. It's more logically makes sense in our analysis in regard to whether the claims is true, more than proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for a very fine speech. Yeah, to summarize all the debates and also ending this debate and also summarize all the government side, I calling upon the government reply here.
Hi, audible and visible, right?
Yes, you both are.
Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think one of the situation that opposition tried to contest is the idea of how it is harder to create gender minority research. Yes, we concede that, but what should we value is what non-gender bias research outshine and push away gender-specific researches. But second of all, I think that why gender-based research has good output and how it incentivizes gender minority research, it is something that we need to value the most. So yes, it's not talking about only like which one is going to be like more into quantity, but also the value and also the output that we provide to you in the very first place. I can say that second of all, their idea about that, gender, it's not sex, so it is something that different. We have a sex-based research and etc. But I think we need to understand that if they said something can coexist, we do not understand just because we do not want non-gender research doesn't mean that we do not have sex-based research at all. But the difference is the incentive on existence of non-gender research, the option doesn't important at all, because our first speaker told you that it's cheaper and etc. So it will going to be like overshadow all of what choices that existing in the current status quo, like gender-based research or sex-based research, because all of the thing that I say. But they say that it is medical research and social research, and it is different at the end of the day. The question is why that cannot be like collaborated in the very first place, and I will like extend it in my classes. I have two classes here. Firstly, about the incentive. Basically, they say that mostly there is still like conservative man researchers. So at the end of the day, it will be like, bias and etc. But I think that, and also more about men and etc. But I think like we can still win in terms of quality. But because even though like man-specific gender research is more existence, it is something that not going to be more generic and more specific towards certain types of individual. This is something that we need to champion in the very first place in terms of quality. But second of all, about better outcomes in research. Kak Gio said, oh, social and medic cannot be together. Then Kak Gray said, it cannot be separated because you can at the end of the day ask for like the data of job and etc. It's contradict one another because at the end of the day it shows you that those type of research cannot be separated in the very first place, right? This is why you need to buy on proposition side. But they also say that, oh, it creates stigma to certain genders because your illness will be most likely to refer because of your man or your woman, or like ADHD because you're a woman and etc. But I think it is to some extent true because somehow we need to like acknowledge that there is a specification of something and we do not need to ashamed about that because the setup of the world is we ashamed because of all of the generic research that already created right now expected us in order to follow a certain generic things that might not be fulfilled and also might not will be like maybe different needs of the gender and etc. We told you that maybe yes, gender research still exists on opposition teams, but the problems then become we need more and more gender research too because it is right now overshadowed. But extending more on like, oh, they said that the questioning about the incentive to focus more on gender specific research is going to be less because of conservativity and etc. Three response coming from three speakers. Firstly, third speaker already told you that people right now is more progressing. I think like the demands will be coming more and more. But second of all, first speaker already told you that the existence of non-gender researchers is easier, so it will be forgetting the other option like the gender-based and etc. But second speaker already told you and also giving the weighing, even if it less incentive to prove that it is not it is unequal and etc. It's going to be like easier under our side of the house because to track the gender is going to be better because it's non-gender.
Okay, thank you for your very fine speech. Yeah, please wait while I deliver myself, and yeah, I will be back in a few minutes maybe. Thank you.